Honorable delegates from the Department of International Trade, Department of Education, Universities United Kingdom International, university leaders, British Council representatives, and representatives from the Indian institutes and universities. Welcome to the Roundtable on Sustainability. Welcome to ATRI, an interdisciplinary research, education, and policy organization. I'm your host for the morning. My name is Siddhartha Krishnan, a social scientist. I head ATRI's Academy for Conservation Science and Sustainability Studies. We have a gratifying presence of university leaders from UK and India. And for their benefit, and before calling upon dignitaries for the welcome and opening remarks, I'd like to draw your very brief attention to the Academy's programs and activities. The Academy has two flagship interdisciplinary programs, a pioneering PhD in conservation and sustainability we launched 12 years ago. We have about 50 students now, 35 have been awarded their PhDs. We partner with the Manipal Academy for Higher Education for our PhD program, and between them they publish almost 65 to 70 peer-reviewed publications in reputed global journals. And we kind of scaled up our interdisciplinary PhD model to a novel masters in conservation practice during the pandemic. We're about to recruit our second batch. We hope to recruit about 25 students. The first batch had about 22 students. And these programs, the PhD and the master's programs, they serve ATRI's mission pillar of training the next generation of environmental leaders. And the Academy's core values are inclusion and diversity. We have a strong gender record. 70% of our PhD students are women students, and 60% of our master students are women students. And we also have a strong affirmative policy that encourages and supports students from marginalized communities to apply. The Academy also offers certificate courses and training and summer course exchange programs. We partner with corporates, academia, and government sectors in offering certificate courses to a diverse demographic ranging from government officials to graduate students. So we partner with the Indian government, who sends their young Indian forest officials for an attachment. We partner with Google. We partner with Swiss universities. We also have study in India opportunities for US universities, and we like to extend it to UK universities. So the United Kingdom's universities, including the leading ones represented by leaders here, have a strong and productive record of offering novel and collaborative higher education solutions and options to partner universities in South Asia and Southeast Asia. ATRI's Academy is keen on exploring this, including the sandwich, twinning, and dual degree programs. And again, to repeat, we have a Study in India program, and we'd love to host British students in our field sites and our community conservation centers in the Eastern Himalayas, the Western Ghats, and the Western Coast. And by way of assessing interest and beginning a conversation with willing university heads here, we will approach you at a convenient time and a convenient space today for a very short digital survey. I now call upon Dr. Kamal Bawa, ATRI's founding president and chair, to present the welcome address and agenda.
Hi, good morning. It's a real pleasure and privilege to welcome distinguished guests to ATRI. When I saw the agenda for the roundtable discussion, I thought it was written by somebody from ATRI. This issue of climate change, ecology and biodiversity, sustainable cities, agriculture and water. These are the pillars of ATRI's work. These topics are also incorporated in a planned mission, a national mission on biodiversity and human well-being. And again, for that mission, ATRI has brought together a biodiversity collaborative, and the mission is in the planning stages. It has been enthusiastically supported by the Office of the Principal Science Advisor to the Government of India. And I believe Dr. Vijay Raghavan was going to be among those who are present today. And he has been a very enthusiastic supporter of this mission. So I think the issues that are going to be discussed today are really very dear to the heart of A-Tree. And A-Tree, for almost 25 years, has been a pioneer in sustainability studies in India. Siddharth just now described very briefly our flagship program, our flagship, I should say, education PhD program in sustainability studies, and a new master's program on conservation and practice. We also have 5 community conservation centers in different parts of India, which really provide a real-life experience in some of the challenges we, as well as the planet, is facing in sustainability. And I'm again very happy to welcome you, and we hope this roundtable not only leads to a very good discussion of some of the critical issues we are facing, but also increasing collaboration. I think collaboration is the key word to address many of these complex challenges. Collaboration not only among individuals within institutions, among institutions, and among countries. So therefore, we are very happy to have you, and welcome again. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jalaka Pushpanathan, the Director, British Council, South India, the opening remarks.
The synergies between A-Tree and our entire delegation are matched. So we're very excited and we look forward to a wonderful interaction. And thank you to Veena and the entire team at A-Tree for pulling this together and for inviting us and being so gracious and generous with your time today. We have a group of 22 UK university higher education leaders with us today. And we have an equal number or even more of Indian institutions with us. And we have an esteemed panel with us who are going to talk about sustainability. So from the British Council, we are very delighted that we found a terrific partner in A-Tree. Thank you so much. And so far, the delegation has had a fruitful visit. This is day 5, last day, but I think they've had a very, very fruitful visit so far. They've been in Delhi for 2 days, and then, we have the largest, among the largest delegation, we have the largest number of people in Bangalore, and then a few in Calcutta and Ahmedabad. This visit has been organized in partnership with Department for International Trade, Department for Education, UUKI. Vivian Stern is leading the delegation today, and she's going to be on a panel, a little later. And of course, we couldn't have done this without A-Tree's help. And also yesterday we were at NCBS. We had a great interaction there as well. So we are very, very excited to listen to all the panelists and also see what outcomes can be had from this meeting at A-Tree. And you mentioned in your presentation that you have a partnership with MAHI, and incidentally, Manipal Academy of Higher Education has entered into an MOU with Nottingham Trent University, and we have Cillian from Nottingham Trent here, so it'll be really wonderful if some collaboration could come out of that as well. The UK is India's largest country partner in education, with partnerships covering primary education to higher education. Just gonna hold this, yeah. There are long-standing scholarship programs for Indian students to study in the UK. Don't worry. such as the Chevening and Commonwealth scholarships and links between British and Indian higher education institutions. UK-India collaborations in research have increased over the years, accompanied by an increase of highly cited research outputs. And when we were speaking to Veena, one thing came up that, a lot of these partnerships, especially the largest, perhaps one of the largest bilateral programs, which you all may be aware of, UK-India Education Research Initiative, I think a lot of partnerships are already existing, and probably from faculty interactions, maybe two individuals find that sort of, spark, and then these partnerships and research collaborations exist. But I think from the British Council's point of view, and definitely from A3's point of view, I think what we want this delegation and this meeting of the minds to achieve is to move to a more sort of structured, institutionalized way of partnership, perhaps also looking at wider consortia approaches where large numbers of universities or institutions or think tanks can come together and engage in meaningful collaboration and partnership. So we believe that this is a good starting point for us to have that conversation. You also may be aware that in 2021, both Prime Ministers Boris Johnson and Narendra Modi signed to a 2030 India-UK roadmap. And I think the roadmap is a brilliant way to sort of reiterate and reinforce the wonderful bilateral connections that both India and UK have. And one of the outcomes of that bilateral agreement is the Living Bridge Partnership, which both Prime Ministers alluded to. And we think that this is another shining example of that as well. And of course, we are all sitting in Bengaluru, the home of the NEP, if you will. And yesterday we heard Dr. Kasturi Rangan talk to us about not just the NEP, but also the broader vision for Indian education for the next 10 years and 15 years. So we believe that the NEP gives us a wonderful context to look at internationalization through the lens of collaboration, partnerships in research. So again, I think we are in the right place at the right time, and we look forward to many more good conversations like this. I just want to sort of talk a little bit about the roadmap, and one of the objectives of the roadmap is also to combat climate change by 2030, a new collaboration on clean energy transition and protecting forests, and a joint leadership to develop resilient infrastructure in countries vulnerable to climate change. A little bit about British Council's work in this area. So British Council addresses these through our projects like the Climate Connection, engaging people around the world through arts and culture, through education, through English language, and bringing their voices and work to the table to support stakeholders in addressing this huge climate emergency that affects all of us equally. A particular focus of the program is on engaging the next generation of climate leaders and giving practical support to young people in communities impacted by climate change, helping them to share their perspectives globally and achieve real action on the ground and real change. The program has also included a number of research projects, policy dialogues, thought leadership pieces, as well as impact evaluations. And we'd love to share some of those links with Adrian if you would like to share them further on. We've also provided some seed funding to 3 India-UK partnerships in the area of disaster-resilient infrastructure as part of the British Council's program that was introduced last year called the Going Global Partnerships Project. One particular notable project is where Teesside University in the UK is collaborating with their Indian partners and are developing a transdisciplinary course on disaster-resilient infrastructure for the purpose of teaching and learning in higher education institutions in India. This is, again, part of the Going Global Program partnerships. It also has additional funding from the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office. And interestingly, this project was initiated further to a conversation between Prime Minister Modi and Alok Sharma, the president of COP26, which took place in Glasgow last year. So during the virtual summit, climate change and cooperation between our 2 countries, UK and India, was a very important agenda point. The Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, CDRI, is one of the successful outcomes of this bilateral cooperation in recent years. And this was launched by Prime Minister Modi at the UN Climate Ambition Summit in New York in September 2019. So we're working very closely with CDRI on this project and would love to share some results when it comes through. And one other growing global partnership very close to Bangalore and close to home where we are is the Indian Institute of Science and UCL in the UK working on urban resilience and infrastructure again. So that's another interesting one as well. So A3 already has, I mean, when we were talking, we also realized that A3 already has significant UK partnerships on sustainable water resources, changing water cycles, sustainability, and also have research collaborations with several UK universities like Cambridge, Oxford, and many others. But I think today's program is more about how we can do a deep dive into what the existing partnerships are and also explore newer ways of working with a wider group of people and wider group of universities to try and see how we can push the agenda of sustainability forward. Looking internally as an organization, we believe that our own operations and activities have an impact on the environment, and we're very conscious of it. And Barbara is here. Barbara's there. Okay, so she's our leader of India, and she constantly reminds us and brings our attention to even the very smallest detail, like a plastic stirrer in a teacup. So thank you, Barbara, for that. So we are very conscious of that, and we are committed to managing and minimizing that impact. Our environment management system has achieved ISO 14001 certification across our UK estates. We use our environmental framework tool to manage our environmental impact in over the 100 countries that we work with. The topic of today's roundtable is very, very close to our heart. And thanks to BNI, you've pulled together a very eminent panel, so I don't want to stand between you and the panel, but I'm sure you're all excited as much as I am to listen to them. And once again, with deep gratitude to A3 and everybody who's pulled this together, welcome. I add my welcome to Dr. Baba's welcome and look forward to hearing from the panel on how to take some of these conversations forward. Thank you very much.
May I now call upon my colleague, Dr. Veena Srinivasan, Director of A3 Center for Social and Environmental Innovation, to guide us through the panel discussion, enabling sustainability research to achieve transformative change.
Thank you again to everyone. I think without any further ado, let me introduce the four panelists. Our first panelist is Professor Vijay Raghavan, who is, of course, the former scientific advisor to the Prime Minister, Professor Vijay. We also have Ms. Vivian Stern, Director, Universities UK. Professor Claire O'Malley, who's the Pro-Vice Chancellor of Durham University. And then finally, we have Kapil Vishwanathan, the Chairman of Freya University. I'm grateful to all of you, firstly, for accepting our invite and agreeing to be on the panel. I think there's just one thing I want to say before we get started is that actually I think today's structure is slightly different from yesterday in the sense that we have a number of people from think tanks, startups, and industry in addition to universities here. So it's not a pure research university crowd. And as I understood, this was one of the key agendas also of the British delegation, was not just to make partnerships with universities, but also between university and the wider society in which we inhabit. So really excited. I wanted to welcome everyone here who's from outside academia to kind of indulge us a little bit in kind of, entertaining and being willing to engage with university. Because that's kind of the panel for this morning, which is really about not just research for research's sake, but research for transformation. And what I thought we would do is basically go through a quick discussion on what it's going to take for us to craft a research agenda that's actually going to move needles on the ground. We've seen constantly alarm bells being raised about humanity being at a crossroads where losing biodiversity, climate crisis is going to wipe out, all of civilization. And I think we recognize that as a society, if we don't do something about it, instead of just writing about it, then everything else that we do is rendered irrelevant because, if humanity itself doesn't exist in 200 years, what's the point? So I think with this kind of fairly considerable challenge placed before you and acknowledging when we're talking about sustainability science, which as we do at A3, It's really a use-inspired science. I guess I wanted to get us kick started in basically saying, firstly, having each of you kind of reflect on this idea of translating research into actually making an impact on the ground. I know every one of you has had a journey on this based on what I've read on each of your profiles. And I was wondering if you could reflect on, we could just start from Professor Vijayaraghavan and go left. But if each of you could just reflect on how you've done this in your own institutions, what have been kind of the key elements that have allowed you to shift from a pure, we wrote a lot of papers to we wrote a lot of papers and it actually changed something. Do you want to start?
Thank you very much, Veena, and nice to be with all my fellow panelists and everyone here. I'm probably in this room least qualified to say what needs to be done because my own research is farthest from application. I study how fruit flies walk and fly. And at the same time, as Veena pointed out, all that we do must be in some manner focused on addressing these major global issues which we face today. So let me, in one sentence, summarize what I think our way of functioning should be. That unless you are a journalist, and journalists have the luxury of saying what they please, rightly so, without necessarily doing anything about what they're talking about, everyone else needs to actually, put their money where their mouth is. So we may write articles about what needs to be done, what the state of the planet is, and so on and so forth. But in our lives, in our institutional lives, in our regional lives, national, international, our goal must be to address this big problem. The analogy is, to what happened to many scientists, whether they were working on the most fundamental or the most applied during the Second World War. Not a very nice metaphor, but everyone actually, helped in multiple ways in the war effort, no matter what they were doing. So even if you're an algebraic geometer or string theorist, there are things to be done now. And indeed, that was illustrated during the pandemic, the ongoing pandemic, when people from all walks of life came in and rubbed shoulders with everyone else to address important questions. So when there is a crisis right upon us, people tend to come together and work together. But while we are reasonable at handling crisis, we are not good at preventing them. So today's crisis is special. And why is that special? I'll just say that in a few words and then pass it on. Where are we coming from? We're coming from a situation of a series of accidents which led us here. 65 million years ago, an asteroid crashed on this planet and eliminated many large forms of life, such as dinosaurs, resulting in the mammalian radiation growing disproportionately. And that resulted in subsequently primates, hominins, and then Homo sapiens coming about. That's a long story, but the ability to oppose thumb and forefinger, to use fire, to speak, all of that allowed Homo sapiens to start changing the planet. Now, we would be running out of resources to do this as humans, but for certain interventions. One intervention I'll mention briefly is the ability to grab nitrogen from air through the Haber process and make fertilizer. Today, half the nitrogen in each of us comes from the Haber process. And this allowed humans to get out of the Malthusian trap and have agricultural productivity, so-called, supposedly not limiting. And this was the way for every other kind of technological leap, which was based on a rising middle class using technology to exploit human and natural resources in a manner to have rapid advancement in standards of living, no matter what happens to the environment. And the assumption was that there will constantly be technological solutions to get us out of environmental traps, Malthusian traps, and so on and so forth. But that's finally changed now. We have a situation where, for example, 10,000 years ago, all vertebrate biomass humans, their livestock, and their pets occupied 1% of vertebrate biomass. And today, humans, our livestock, and pets occupy 98% of vertebrate biomass. So we have moved, as Dan Dennett pointed out, from being survivors on this planet to those who wield the paintbrush for the future of the planet. Now, what should we do? That is a big challenge because there is an assumption that there's a fix by people who know what the problem is, stating the problem, that science and technology will come to the rescue. But the fundamental drivers of rescue are really economics, sociology, and politics. And our inability to engage with these three, no matter how much technological solutions there are, is going to lead to guaranteed failure. A 2030 goal of any sort is completely unrealistic for a very simple reason. You have a rising middle class. That rising middle class has aspirations. That rising middle class, which drove the first industrial revolution, is rising in India, in China, in Latin America, and the rest of Asia. That looks at steel and cement as the core of its success. I'm putting it rather bluntly. And therefore, the access to all of that will have to be denied by the rich countries if one is to address the issues of climate change. And that's not going to happen. So the question is, how does one go around this economic, social, and political change and have that addressed while we address the big issues? Now, technology is a very important player here. It's not a negligible player. And there are many technologies available. But again, there, environmentalists need to grasp a very simple point. Renewable technologies, and there is lots of work to be done on that, lots happening, are not going to be a solution for this kind of a scale. As experts have pointed out, if you want to have Tokyo run on renewable technology, that's not going to be possible, the kind of energy requirements, or Mumbai, for example. And therefore, what is the solution? So technology linked with social and political aspects needs to address this. How much renewable? How much can you alter renewable in a manner where you have enough ways by which you deal with the environmental costs of mass producing renewable energy sources? I mean, mining is a major challenge over there. Similarly, there's another big challenge, which if you look at the CO2 emissions in the US due to consumption or to production, it's declining rapidly. But it's declining rapidly because of massive imports from China, where CO2 emissions are going up due to manufacturing and consumption. So, a national perspective, again, is not enough. So to summarize, I think that there's been a major failure which we need to address, that our institutions nationally and internationally have not engaged with the social, political, economic solutions along with the technological ones on scale. We each view ourselves as a department of X or Y looking at a solution of a particular kind. And this is useful, it is necessary, but it's not sufficient. So the question is, how can one scale? And very simply, for example, if you take Bangalore, if you have all the institutions in Bangalore working together as one with this one goal, then you're going to see a potential for addressing this. Now, this is a very good goal, but it's not possible in India because you have IISC, it's about me. IIT, it's about me. AIIMS, it's about II. So until we move out of that situation and see beyond our noses, this is not going to happen. So the solution is staring at us, but the administrative and other structures which we have built, isolation is necessary for excellence, but we need to break isolation if you want to solve any problem. And that really, to my mind, is the key. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. That's a hard act to follow, and I have to disagree with your claim to be the least well-informed or well-qualified person to comment on this question in the room. I'm not even a scientist, so I can't claim to be contributing anything much to the sum of human knowledge. But I am my role, as I see it in the world, is to act to facilitate the efforts of our universities to address this problem. And the reason I find it possible to kind of look in the mirror in the morning, given the scale of the challenge you've described, is that I think when you look at the combined potential of universities, not only in the UK, but around the world, to address this problem from multiple dimensions, if there is hope for humankind, it exists in the institutions represented in this room and many rooms like it around the world. I'm going to start, though, I think, with your challenge that unless you're a journalist, every single person in any role, no matter what it may be, needs to ask themselves a question: what am I personally doing in relation to this challenge? And so I'm going to start with what we as Universities UK have been doing. And the answer to that question is that we have devoted resource, human capacity to developing what we hope will become a strategic response at the sector level to the challenge of climate change. In the international function which I lead, that means asking institutions to come together and share what they are doing to reconcile the international activities that they're pursuing, the desire to travel around the world, making contacts with collaborators, to recruit students, to send staff around the world, how they reconciled all of those activities with their own ambitions around achieving carbon neutrality by a certain date. Many universities have their own goal. And what we're doing is what we always do, I think, best, which is bring people together to share their bright ideas and spread a sense of what can be achieved from one institution to another. At a broader organizational level, we've been working with institutions to try to help them to establish their own well-informed and well-structured strategies, targets, ambitions, again, trying to cross-fertilize what one institution is doing well with what another institution sees only as a set of questions and challenges that are insurmountable. So in a little way, that might be the first step towards us playing a catalytic role in the UK sector to help institutions address the challenge at the institutional level. My other job, I think, as I see it, is to influence policy. And I want to pick up on your point about what I think I'm going to describe as the urgent need for global team effort. Now, in the UK, we've got a highly collaborative system. Actually, it's I think maybe my colleagues in the room will disagree with me, but I would say that it's more habitually collaborative internationally than it is domestically. That there's a sort of, there is an instinct to collaborate internationally, and 60% of our international our research outputs have an international co-author or co-producer. Whether or not we're as good at collaboration within the UK, I think I'll leave it to my colleagues to comment on. But and you will know better than anybody, having been involved in this from the national perspective in India, we are still, I think, a little hamstrung by the structures that support the collaboration between our institutions across institutional geographic boundaries. You know, it seems to me that our effort at the policy level has to be to kind of clear the obstacles out of the way so that institutions can collaborate at scale across disciplinary and geographic boundaries, and that is possible. But at the moment, those structures they're often bilateral rather than multilateral. They are, you know, you have administrative, bureaucratic obstacles to large-scale research collaboration, you know, double jeopardy, the difficulty of aligning funding cycles. We have some good examples of very, very significant large-scale global collaborations, and I think we need to look at those examples and build on them. And that actually there is an opportunity here, because certainly in the UK government, but I think in governments around the world, there is an increasing sort of tendency to think about the funding of missions in research, to identify big themes and then construct research funding instruments behind those big themes. And the fact that so many governments have a common focus on all aspects of climate science, from the technology we need to reduce our dependence on hydrocarbons, through to the the ways that as societies will need to adapt to the changes that are already upon us. And that presents, I think, an opportunity for us to be more ambitious in creating large-scale, long-term, multilateral common pots, that allow the global team effort, which is so obviously needed. I think the final thing that I'll say is that, perhaps coming back to my first point, that I'm generally an optimist, and I'm a glass half full person, and I tend to think that everything is fixable. And when you see, even in the last few years, how much faster than we imagined the impact of climate change is affecting all of our lives, I have to say, I wonder if we're not frightened enough. I think that, despite my optimism, we have to contribute, we have to continue to contribute to the effort that's been made by so many people, including during the recent COP summit, to communicate the urgency of this challenge. And I think for an organization like ours, that means making it front and center of the way that we talk about the contribution that universities make to our society, that instead of listing climate as one of the very many things that universities contribute to society, more and more we should talk about it as the first thing that university, and I don't mean just in the research effort, I also mean in preparing students, graduates, the people who will contribute to addressing these problems in the next generation, that has to be part of the story that we tell our societies and our governments. But perhaps to end on a slightly more optimistic note, there are 13 or 16 universities in this room, and 16, thank you very much, I can't count, maths was never my strong point, but I think every single one of these universities could tell you a story about the things that are being discovered in their institutions, the interventions that they're making, the partnerships they're forming with industry or with international counterparts, and that should be a source of some small optimism. I think it's a huge contribution that institutions can make to the future of mankind.
Hello, everybody. My name is Claire O'Malley, Pro-Vice Chancellor Global at Durham University. I'm sorry, but I am least qualified on this panel. But yeah, we are competing. But on the other hand, actually, I think I do have something of a perspective to contribute here. I'm a psychologist. Actually, I did do a piece of research relevant to climate change, and this is pertinent to the point that you made, was it DJ, about I and me. There's a concept, a phenomenon known as psychological distance in social psychology, whereby anything that's to do with you, them, not me, anything that's far away, not here, not near, anything that's sometime in the future, not immediate, is unlikely to be acted upon. And as soon as you experience flooding in your own backyard, as we have over recent years in the UK, in parts of Yorkshire, up in the northeast where I live at the moment, in the Midlands, in Wales, all over, we get these increasingly extreme weather events that lead to flooding. And everybody in the UK says, oh my God, what's happening? But it's not until you do that that you start thinking that maybe there is something to this. And the small amount of research that I have contributed to this effort actually showed through careful, experimental methods and survey methods that people's attitudes towards climate change, their willingness to go the extra mile in terms of changing their behaviors, their patterns, their purchasing, etc., does not change until they experience those immediate impacts. And so I think me and I is important. I'd like to stick with the local a bit whilst we're talking about global challenges, and some of the research that we're doing at Durham University is very much about local activity. It's about engaging with communities, with local politicians, with local policymakers, and with businesses in the region to change perhaps the way in which we use energy. A very small example, but I think really interesting is, sorry to be anecdotal, but Durham sits on a huge number of former coal mines, which are now disused because the coal mining industry got decimated. But in those pits sits huge amounts of warm water. It's not hot enough to shower in, but it's warm. It's much warmer than the water on the surface. Now, by tapping into those mines, you can boil your kettle far more efficiently by using that warm water than by boiling it from cold. I mean, that's a very mundane caricature of the whole project of geothermal energy. And that's just one example of the clean energy ecosystem that we're trying to achieve within the northeast of England. So we are working with local authorities to see if we can heat people's homes in those former mining villages who's sitting on untapped riches in terms of clean energy, so that that water directly heats their homes. But there's a bigger ecosystem in that region, and that's we, in that part of the world, are living on a very windy coast, the northeast of England. The North Sea gets extremely windy. We get storms every year, more and more violent storms. And our scientists are working with wind turbines to tap that energy. We also, up and down that coast, have got businesses who are setting up in terms of electric vehicles, creating batteries. We've got scientists working on hydrogen fuels. So there is an ecosystem that's developing, and the 5 universities in that region are now collaborating together rather than competing, although of course naturally we do compete, and working with businesses to try and make a bigger impact locally on policy change. Now, what's that got to do with perhaps our collaborations in India? Everything, because actually those scientists I'm talking about are working with you guys in India on the same sort of problems, but then translated into your local environment and context. And then I suppose that's the third point I want to make. It is about how we engage with the communities and all stakeholders in the region, rather than doing the research and then translating it and doing to the community and bestowing our wisdom on the community. I think it's very important that we co-create. And the very first person I met here this morning was Deepta Satish, sitting over there, who introduced herself as being in art and design for sustainability, and working with local stakeholders, local communities, about what weather and water and everything means to people, and how we talk what the big word ontologies of our concepts of climate, weather, environment are. And I think it's very important that we do understand culturally what these things mean to people, because if we can tap into practice, culture as well, and understand not about getting people to change what they do, but getting people to think thoughtfully, purposefully about how what they do interacts and impacts, then I think we're not going to achieve change either. I guess, sorry, final point is, again, coming back to the point about psychology being important, I think incentive structures are really important. And again, Vijay, you're absolutely right. Unless we address the economics, the finance, those drivers of our human behavior, and is it worthwhile changing to, first world problem, right? I'm not going to change my currently diesel powered car to an electric car. Well, if it's convenient, I will. And if I can afford it, I will. So until we address green finance, until we get the banks on board and so on, we're also not going to achieve change. But thank you.
Well, I must thank Vera for letting me go last, because I now have the last word, and I can say without doubt that I'm the least qualified in the room. So some of you heard me speak about Kriya's approach to research, which is essentially transformative in our ambition yesterday. But for those of you who heard me yesterday, thanks for tolerating me again. But those of you who weren't there yesterday, Kriya's approach to research, he talked about three aspects of it. The first is it's challenge-based as opposed to disciplinary, and not necessarily opposed to disciplinary, but challenge-based and collaborative, simply because I can write a paper, but we can only solve a global wicked challenge. I cannot solve, to Vijay's point earlier, I cannot solve a wicked problem of the world. And third, connected with the real world. So this is broadly sort of Kriya's approach to research. And I talked yesterday about how our Center for Brain and Mind is almost a perfect example of how we'd like to set up these challenge-based centers. And I also talked about our ambition to set up centers in other areas and based on other challenges. And sustainability is very much front and center. We've taken some fledgling steps there, including recently appointing a faculty director for a Center for Environment Research. And Chirag is one of my colleagues from the faculty is also here with us today. And they're sort of putting the contours of this together. We also have a water project which Veena is also involved in. So we're already starting to do a little bit of collaboration and so on. But I wanted to bring attention today to maybe three aspects which I think are necessary for transformative research. The first is, as all of us have been saying, it has to be collaborative, and not just collaborative within academia. I think if you want transformation, you need to think and do. So I think it's beyond the communities. You also need to look at not just scholarship and think tanks, but also do tanks, and all coming together to solve the problems of the world. And I think Mr. Stern was saying earlier that we should reduce our barriers to collaboration. I don't think distance or language are the real barriers. I think the real barrier, which brings me to my next point, is that there are absolutely no incentives for collaboration. So how do we bring incentives for collaboration? Be they recognition for publications. One of the ideas Veena and I chatted about in the past is could we bring challenge-based funding and challenge-based grants, competitive challenge-based grants, and will that bring people from different institutions, thinkers, doers, members of the community together to solve the problem? And the third aspect, I think, is assuming we get people to collaborate and there are incentives. How do we know that we're solving the world's problems? How are we tracking against our goal of so our goal is 10, we're at 3, we need to get to 7 by next year. There's just no mechanism for that, especially in as complex a field as sustainability. So I guess more questions than answers, but that's where we are.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask a provocative question as a follow-up, and then we'll quickly open it up for a couple of questions. I think all four of you kind of hit on a common theme, which was, and I'm going to call it the moving from the I frame to the S frame, because you said I. And in psychology, there was a really interesting paper recently on how we cannot expect individual action to kind of solve wicked problems. And we really need to move from I frame thinking to S frame thinking, which is individual to systemic. So to some extent, one of the struggles that Kapil talked about incentives, and Vivian, you said, one of the things is that we have enough brain power to kind of transform some of these problems. The trick, of course, is in how do we make those brains kind of come together? Now, to some extent, the way universities or our entire project of academia is structured is from 200 years, old. I mean, we have long histories in the UK, much longer than India, but even in India, many universities which are sitting on legacies of 150 to 200 years. And so there's a particular way of doing things. You have faculty, they teach, they get tenure, they publish in these papers. The concept of journal itself is something that emerged when people had to write to each other in post and so on. And so there was a particular structure that drove it. So the provocative question I wanted each of you to ask is, if you could start with a blank slate and redesign everything, what are kind of a couple of things where you didn't even have to have universities, or you didn't have to have money given in this way, or you didn't have to have incentives and funding and all of this? What are a couple of things that you might do? And I'm sorry, you're the first, you have to go first, but if you could blow the entire system up and start from scratch, what would you do? There are obviously people cheering for blowing the entire system up.
Sorry. Thank you. Some years ago, the then Cambridge Vice Chancellor visited India, and that's, I think, an 800-year-old university. So on a very different topic, I asked Boris, how do you keep vibrant and alive? And the point was that in his mind, it wasn't an 800-year-old institution. It was constantly a young, curious puppy which had to be renewed. So, you know, there's a lot of renewal going on. So, I mean, realistically, these structures are not going to disappear, because just as many economic and political structures are not going to disappear. So one can't wish them away unless there's an asteroid hitting the Earth again. But in this situation, what do we do? Now, the point which, you know, we heard about multilateral funding which is challenge-based, is a route out. Now, that needs to also go hand in hand with one major change within institutions. And that's very difficult, but somewhat feasible. Currently, institutional administrative responsibility falls into two big boxes. One is that serving as, you know, intermediaries, post people, as it were, between the faculty and granting agencies, urging them to get resources in multiple ways and teach as an income generation paradigm. Now, that system needs to break. That is, the administration then starts viewing the faculty as resources to get income in multiple ways, or sustain the university by undergraduate teaching and so on. So that goes against the fundamental core, where these things have to be consequences, and scholarship and intellectual quest has to be very important. The second aspect of institutional failure in universities is as a consequence of the first, is not taking on institutional goals and responsibilities, but putting them onto individual faculty members. And that's unfair, because you're then evaluating each faculty member according to what they do, and the institutional evaluation is a cumulative of the whole. That needs to change, and institutions, universities in particular, need to address big problems. This is, again, a feasible kind of change. So these two things, institutions taking more responsibility in multiple ways, or rather than serving primarily as conduits, is important. Now, this has been addressed in many places by having centers around universities which focus on different themes, but they too have been, you know, focused substantially to achieve their goals by raising resources of various kinds. So in other words, the derivative starts taking on primary purpose rather than the purpose itself. How do I get money for sustaining the center? How do I get money, salaries, and so on and so forth? And the principal goal then, you know, goes for a toss. So these are issues which can be addressed, but I think they can be addressed substantially in big city contexts such as Bangalore or Hyderabad, or in the UK, in the London region. There are already collaboratives of various kinds. But that requires a change in the financial management of institutions, which is not easy.
You sidestepped it by saying we'll nudge our way towards it. We can't get rid of that, but
it's an absolutely wonderful question, and I feel a failure for not being able to imagine a totally different model of doing things. And I'm also going to disappoint people from the UK. Will know that that 95% of my time at the moment is spent thinking about whether the UK is about to get kicked out of Horizon Europe, which is this huge, you know, platform for collaboration. You know, you can take part in projects with people from, you know, it's about, I mean, 150 countries, you know, get involved in Horizon projects. And so I recognize that it is enormously disappointing that I'm about to say that I think that the thing that we are about to get kicked out of in Europe provides a model for what we should be doing at a global level, which is creating a massive, great big common pot, which is mission driven. I mean, Release has this focus on sort of very, very core, very clear missions, but that effectively allows whoever wants to work together towards those goals to do so. You know, only excellence being the criteria. and that should be on a long-term basis. So all of our funding cycles are pretty short-term. I mean, in the UK, we get this sort of funding dolloped out if we're lucky on a 3-year cycle, and it's quite hard to plan for the long-term, really big, ambitious interventions on that basis. So, I mean, if I could wave a magic wand, I would say, create a funding structure at a global level with whichever countries feel that they want to be part of this global team effort. Make it long-term, make it sort of 10 years. You know, try to get past the failure of political cycles, which gets in the way when we're trying to agree bilateral funding, and focus it, you know, not on a disciplinary basis, because I think we do tend to sort of marginalize social sciences and humanities and arts in the sort of discussions about the solutions to climate change. They all have a role to play, I think, as Claire has pointed out. But can we build that? I think that's what we should work towards. An even more mundane answer, and one which I guess everyone in the room, at least on the UK side, would have a view on, is the shift to rewarding impact as opposed to publication. And there's an industry in that, and it's, I think, probably irritates universities enormously to have to write impact case studies to submit to our research excellence framework process. But our system has shifted in the last decade or so towards one which tries to reward impact. And I think that is probably quite an important shift in mindset, because publications are a massively flawed way of assessing quality. And of course, you know, to make an entirely political point, because of the way that those publications feed into reputation and rankings, they distort the understanding of where excellence lies, because of the way that publication can be skewed towards particular geographies. We've been a beneficiary of that, but that isn't, I think, a reason to hold on to it. But that's what I think. You know, I don't want to blow up any of our universities; they're all wonderful. I do think shifting structures within universities, as you've said, is important. Actually, Cambridge has an example of this, which I'm quite inspired by. They have an initiative called Cambridge Zero. And as I understand it, it's a sort of beacon within the institution. Every effort that is being made right across the institution towards net zero is sort of corralled under the heading of Cambridge Zero. And many institutions have a similar sort of approach. How can you create some kind of point of focus so your effort is visible, but also that internally people collaborate within the institution in a way that perhaps doesn't happen when the effort is siloed in disciplinary structures. So somehow there's a structural answer within institutions too, I think.
Vivian, I'd like to build on what you just said and think about what happens within institutions, because the challenges that we're facing are, of course, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary. And I can speak from the heart, because I've worked all my career at interfaces between disciplines and in institutions across departments. And I think everybody who is in an academic institution in this room recognizes the tension that there often is between disciplines and departments and their financial incentives, how they're structured, the whole career progression system that is driven by disciplinary and departmental considerations. But we're being asked to contribute to research topics that necessitate setting up cross-departmental institutes that often are not based on that kind of similar funding model. The income goes back to the departments. If you're training master's students within those institutes, it goes back to the home departments that contribute, usually that contribute to those institutes. And I have worked at several institutions, and I don't know any, certainly in the UK, that's got that model right. Also then going back to, I think you didn't say the R word, but going back to the REF in the UK, the Research Excellence Framework, that we've just realised the results of the last one quite recently. Again, despite every effort on each iteration of REF, still rewards disciplinary single disciplinary efforts, and the same traditional recognition of high quality journal outputs, which is right, which is great. Fundamental basic science and arts and humanities and social science is really important. And I wouldn't want to blow that up. I wouldn't want to change. Again, going back to psychology, a Russian psychologist, Vygotsky, made a big deal of talking about how we made evolutionary leaps by building on the technologies that scholars had developed, and systems of writing, systems of reading were hugely important in enabling us to develop psychologically and then societally to be able to realize the kind of lives that we have now. But that's a bit of a digression. But to come back now, I do think single disciplines are important, but we have to be able to think about how we support and reward cross-boundary working. And if we think about our early career academics who want to get promoted, want to get on, want to get recognized, the whole system works against them because they engage in research projects across departments, but they're usually led by a PI who's often a professor, and the institution recognizes the PI because it's easy to count and account for what the PI leads in our systems of accounting for research inputs and outputs, than to be able to count up the relative contributions of every single collaborator on the project that's in different departments. So our system of measuring and tracking and accounting also mitigates against encouraging cross-disciplinary working. And then finally, when it comes to promotion and progression, again, the panels within departments that sit and ponder about the merits of the cases that are coming towards them are used to recognizing things within their own disciplines, within their own departments. And it's often quite challenging to weigh up the qualities of a candidate for promotion when they have made contributions across several disciplines. If you think about the big teams that are required to work on huge space science projects, you've got statisticians, you've got technical experts, you've got the physicists, so on and so forth. And recognition of their efforts depends on which discipline they return to. And again, in my own experience in science and social science, multidisciplinary research, often the statisticians are the most important, but they get last mentioned on the paper because they just kind of did the technical bit according to the people who are leading the research rather than the intellectual bit. And that's just not fair. And unless we start to try and unpick and become a bit more innovative and open-minded about our incentive structures, our financial structures, our budgetary structures, and our reward and recognition structures, again, coming back to behavior change, we won't change behavior.
So I guess when your house is on fire, you call the fire service. You don't go running to academia, right? And that's for a good reason. And if you ask anybody in the fire department what their job is, they would say it is to put out fires and save lives. That is clarity of purpose. If you ask people in academia what their purpose is, you hear many different things. And there are many different roles that academia needs to play in society. But if you were to hit reset, the one thing that I would say is to bring in clarity of purpose and ownership of solving the world's problems, in addition to providing so many other aspects of society that in community that universities play a role in. So I think an example of this is when, for example, when COVID happened, what typically takes 10 years to approve a drug, we did in months, which so it's the clarity of purpose, it's the urgency we can bring into it. And if you ask anybody in academia what their purpose is or what their job is, if they have clarity on what the answer is and how I think that's what structurally would make a difference.
Thank you. I mean, it's a three-year-old university, so I think there's just excited about what's possible. I don't know. We started late. I don't know whether we should take one question or. Okay. There is a question, so we'll take one question and then.
Okay, is that on? I'm going to be really cheeky, actually. I'm not going to ask a question. I'm going to make a statement. So I'm not going to make a statement. Is it working, this? Yeah, I'm not going to make a statement as a university leader. I'm going to make a statement as a professor of ecology and a former trustee of the Worldwide Fund for Nature, WWF. So there's two things that no one's touched on that are really central to this debate. I'm going to tell a short story at the end. So the first is the single thing that made the biggest difference to this debate was a report published by Sir Nicholas Stern in 2006, The Economics of Climate Change. And unless you can change the economic system, you're never going to have the drivers that you need, that we need, to really transform the way that we think about climate and carbon. That's the first thing. The second thing is food. No one has mentioned food. Okay, you can do all you like around energy and sustainability, but unless you change the world's food systems, you're never going to solve the problems that we're talking about. And the third thing is that people don't really understand this. I'll give you an example. So when Greta Thunberg started striking and British school children started staying out of school and protesting, we had a massive protest in Manchester, which is the city where I live and work. When that protest finished and you looked around the place, you saw two things. You saw a load of litter from burgers, McDonald's and Burger King and takeaways, and you saw lots of kids walking away clutching Primark carrier bags. So what does that tell me? They were not trained in carbon literacy. They didn't understand the food they were eating was contributing to the problem they were protesting against. They didn't understand that fashion contributes towards 10% of all global pollution. Unless the way we think about clothing changes, it will get to 50% by 2050. So those will be my points. More focus on the economics of all of this and more focus on food systems. So apologies for being really cheeky and not asking a question, but I hope you don't mind me contributing those reflections. Thank you.
Sounds good. Is that do you want to make a sure? Do you want?
Thank you. And I think I'm making a similar point, but in the form of a question. So first of all, can I say, Vijay, thank you very much for the way you structured your introduction to this, because I think as humans, unless we understand that we are very much a small part of the 13.7 billion years of existence, we're just not going to get it. So it goes back to the point you're making, Malcolm, do people really understand where we fit into the whole universal system? And we've just got to change that. The minor commitment I've decided today is from now on, all documents will be signed on the 11th of June, 13.7 billion, 2002. And even why are we using 2002? Because that in itself implies a time, particularly Judeo-Christian Islamic mindset. And we've just got to change that kind of date mindset that people have. And maybe, Claire, that's down to the point that you were making about how do we get people to have that longer range vision. And I suppose the question then that really comes into that, or the second question, is, we're trying to improve the understanding of our students, and we think that global mindset is a key part of that. So how at the same time do I increase that global mindset, while at the same time saying you can't travel because actually that's contributing to the problem? I think that's the big challenge for us here when we're looking at the internationalization of education, is how do we address that dual issue? Yes, COIL is wonderful, but it doesn't give you the experience of being in Bangalore and going along the streets and getting the smells and the scents and the wonderful colors and the challenges that you're seeing of the people's lives here. So how do we sort of address those two dual issues? Thank you.
I was wondering if anybody wanted to respond, and apparently the VR headset station yesterday at yesterday's British Council event didn't do that for you. I mean, so it's not a substitution to have virtual reality, is what you're saying. There's one more. Okay, we'll do one last question. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Claire, thank you so much for your contributions. I found them, for me, it's the kernel of the problem in the sense that as humans, I think we're cognitively wired to think in I and you and us and them. I think another observation on my part is that we're very fixed on hierarchy and relative advantage. So I think one immediate example for the UK delegation in the room is that we've had some very long days. If I come down this morning and someone says, how do you sleep? And I said, well, not very well, actually. If everyone else says, oh, I also slept terribly, I feel better, that doesn't make me feel less tired, the fact that everyone else slept badly. But if everyone turned around and said, actually, I slept really well, I think, well, now I'm at a disadvantage. Now I feel really tired and terrible. So I think, how as humans do we recognize our shortcomings and then harness our shortcomings? Because this is a human problem, I suppose, that we've created. And as humans, we're going to have to respond to this. If we've got very fixed shortcomings, then how do we solve the problem of climate change, sort of recognizing this and harnessing this? Vivian, I think you said incentives are very important, but what other incentives can we use to appeal to us as humans to solve this very human problem?
I think people are going to have a chance to talk in smaller groups. I'm just going to let the panel respond to those, well, comments and a question. 2 comments and a question. Yes, that was a psychology.
Thanks, Amy. I think one thing, building on what you've just said, is about our own peers and our peer community, and certainly amongst younger people. Sounds awful saying amongst younger people, because that makes me, therefore, by definition, old, but I am. I overhear our students talking, commenting on each other's clothes and talking about how they are secondhand. They're pre-loved, and they actually want the pre-loved fashion. So if we can start changing some of those, with a small c, local cultural issues, I think they're great ways of harnessing the really strong effects of peer pressure. And that doesn't just apply to teenagers and those in their early 20s. It applies to people of my generation as well. And we tend to follow what other people are doing who are like us. So how can we get in there? And perhaps we need people's expertise in marketing and advertising insight to understand how we can change some of that. Framing is what it is about our behaviours and reflections upon what we regard as being acceptable versus unacceptable.
Kapil, can I put you on the spot to have the last word here? Because I know that one of the things we talked about is capitalism 2.0. And I think that that's at the core of the question that basically came, saying if your economic systems are about growth and we can say all we want about pre-loved, but if Gap and all, or Pepe or whatever the other big companies are advertising with billboards which are twice as big, then in a sense you're fighting against something much larger. But then there's another perspective, and we perhaps don't have business schools, as many business schools represented here. So I was wondering if you wanted to talk about that and the pathway there, and then we can break up.
Sure, you certainly put me on the spot. From what actually I'm hearing from corporate leaders that I speak with is that there is a very serious commitment to look at doing things very differently in order to be more sustainable. But no one really knows what or how. And so I think the appetite is there. And I also feel that, as I said yesterday, we should, there are 2 schools of thought, right? One is that sustainability is a thing, we can make it happen. But the other is sort of, doomsday, we're too far down the road. But I think if we all sort of take the former, subscribe to the former school of thought and believe that there is a way forward, there's enough evidence of human ingenuity over the past that we can solve the problem if we put our minds to it and commit to it. I see the commitment, at least from the limited set of corporate leaders that I speak with, mostly in this part of the world, that it's very much there. I don't know if that answers your question at all, but.
He's willing to have the last word on that, and then we do have to.
Well, certainly others can add on, but let me just add 2 points, which I think are potentially part of the solution. Because everything else which we do as individuals, institutions, and so on are very important, but we need to simultaneously address scale and impact. Now, one component of scale comes from policy decisions. countries, groups of countries cannot emit more than this. These are the kinds of engines you can use or not, these kinds of targets. So harder and harder targets need to be put. But along with that, there's another component, which is technology transfer. Today's energy sources, unlike the previous ones, fossil fuel ones, are not geography based. They are technology availability based. And therefore, international collaboration, which frees up transfer of technology. Every single major technology for these solutions on scale are available. They should move away from, at least for a defined period during this crisis, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, into ease of transfer of proprietary patented technology to countries where there's capability to deal with that. And this means the African continent, India, other countries to take on, these technologies in their context to drive. So this combination of hard policy tweaks and are needed on scale.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I mean, this has been an incredible panel discussion. So thank you for your time.
So we will begin the session with reporting back from each of the breakout groups. So can I call the volunteers from breakout group 1 to come and present in a minute?
Yes.
Yeah.
Please, let me bring it. So water and agriculture.
Water and agriculture, we covered 3 topics. We covered research priorities, we covered how to get them funded, and then how to find and search people and so that we can have fruitful collaborations. So in terms of research priorities, 5 themes emerged. The first one was the problem of degraded agricultural soils and the fact of soil organic carbon declining and the need to restore it, and the fact that existing interventions and evidence have not actually been significantly effective in restoring degraded agricultural land. And a related topic of pesticides and the battle with pests and over application of pesticides. So both of these on the problem of degraded agricultural land. Climate and the need to future-proof water and agriculture emerged as a cross-cutting theme across everybody's interests. The third theme was soil biology. There's a lot of interest in India on regenerative agriculture and natural farming, but a lot of the science of soil biology and soil microbiome was behind. And here at A3 particularly, we have people like Ravikant who are experts in that area, so that emerged. The fourth one was looking at solutions and evaluating solutions in the area of water and climate change. We talked about agroforestry, about natural farming, protective irrigation, a whole range of things which haven't been evaluated in the way they have. So we discussed this idea of living labs, working with intervention organizations to kind of to look at evaluation, equity, sustainability of solutions. And then the last theme that emerged as a research priority was to look at market linkages, because nothing we do in water and agriculture is of any use if farmers can't actually make a decent living out of it. And so again, in India, there are a lot of interesting innovations with farmer producer organizations, farm to fork, and so on. And so we were interested in looking at that. Now, those are the research priorities. In terms of how we might work together, there was this recurring theme of funding and different types of institutions in India having different constraints and different requirements for what they can actually work with. So organizations like A3, which are non-profits, require overheads and salaries to be paid, for example, which often an intergovernmental or bilateral funding doesn't cover. In contrast, we have the National Bureau of Soil Survey. That's a government institution, and they actually require very top-down government clearance to be able to engage with UK. And so if we really want government, private, non-profit, university all to work together, we need funding that can actually account for the constraints of all of those types of institutions. Finally, we discussed how would we actually find each other, because there's only a handful of institutions present today. There's 18 UK universities that need to find appropriate partners. And so one idea that came up is what can we do for short-term engagements or speed dating, so as we might call it, to see how can we find quick engagements, short-term engagements with a whole bunch of Indian and UK partners so that we can find the right partner for more long-term research projects. Okay.
Thanks, Vinu. Can we have the report back from the Energy and Climate Group, please?
Thanks. So we had Claire, Mark, Chirag, Namrata, Ben, and myself having a discussion around the 4 questions around one is what are the primary challenges, opportunities, and for a sustainable transition, and what are the research areas that need to be prioritized to that. We didn't get too much into what partnerships need to be enabled. I think there's a wide understanding around that. And then, of course, we finally settled on the question of what needs to change in the wider research innovation ecosystem for these changes to occur. So, of course, we spent a lot of time discussing what are the challenges, especially given the fact that you do have this wide disconnect between the developed world and the developing world. One is the places where they need to think about how they need to consume less, while at the same time in the developing world, there are energy needs and there needs to be more thought around how will people, get to more energy. But at the same time, it has to be sustainable. And I think one of the terms that came about is that you can't just call it renewable energy because it has impacts on the environment. So you need to call it alternative energy. And I think that's where the things comes up. So just to quickly sum up some of the aspects that came on is that what really needs to be researched is this area of change of behavior. I think that's a very big part of that, both in terms of the developed world as well as the developing world. Of course, there are the other very technical aspects on how do you look at different forms of energy getting infused into the grid. And I mean, there was a question also around nuclear. How do we think about it, given the fact that it's a there are catastrophic risks associated with it, even though we may look at it from a historical perspective and say, the number of lives could be lower. And then, of course, there's this whole issue of methodology or methods that are used to calculate energy consumption, be it in buildings or be it in the scope 3 emissions, or in terms of how do we calculate it, because by just pushing it across the border does not solve the problem for various entities. And one of the examples that came was that UK universities have about 300,000 international students, all of them traveling back and forth, and their parents and their relatives, and that's a lot of emissions right there. So how do you answer that particular aspect? So finally, of course, as you know, let's start with the first thing was it comes down to funding models, right? Every university has been thinking as that students are source for research. And so if you're not thinking about funding for research, you'll think of alternate ways and it ends up being unsustainable. So I think funding models for research is an important area that needs to be looked at. We need to also acknowledge that interdisciplinary way is the way to go. I don't think you can look at it from a siloed perspective that we've been looking at so far. Which also then leads to this broader aspect of incentive structures. How are the current incentive structures created to not just finance, but also lead from research to action? If the lead time is a decade or more, then you have a problem related to that. So this brings us to, of course, the financing options. And then also comes the issues of scale. How do we deal with scale issues when we are looking at some of these fairly long-term and very large issues? And I think this is where the concept of politics and politicians and policy comes into place, because many of them are very, how would you call it, short-lived or short-term, because terms of politicians are limited, terms of bureaucrats are limited, creates very bad incentive structures. So I think that's where it is. I hope I have not confused you more than you were at the beginning, but I think we are definitely enthused that there's more work to be done. So thank you all.
So can we have the report back from the Sustainable Business record?
Thank you very much. We had a really interesting group. So we had Aditya and Shyam from Tata Elixir, who are product designers. And we had Devesh from FluxGen, who's also from the private sector. Then we had Killian and myself, and Killian's an economist and I'm a consumer researcher. And then we had Rishi, Sandeep, Sethi, Shyam, Novin, Yogesh and Yamshi, all from ATRI, who did completely different things. And we had a absolutely fascinating discussion about the role of business. And now you've been talking about funding. We talked about money a lot. And the fact that for a business, the primary motivation is always going to be, does this sustainable product make money? And there's a huge tension between the three parts of the triple bottom line, profit, people, and planet. And we know that if you put people and planet first, you do make money. But when there's a crisis like COVID, suddenly profit becomes incredibly important. So how do you resolve that? And I think what we decided in the end is that the responsibility for sustainability has to sit between four stakeholders. So the government has to be responsible. So things like choice editing. I was talking like if in France, you can't buy an unsustainable light bulb. It's the law. And there's certain regulations in India now for sustainable reporting. The businesses themselves. So what Tata Elxsi are doing are putting sustainable designs into big corporate products that help. The consumer has to have some responsibility, but to be honest, you're not really going to change consumer behavior all that much at the end of the day. It's a big uphill task. But also there's interesting work being done on communities, and understanding the community is also very important. So we thought these four areas where the responsibility has to be taken, and our job as academics is to feed in ideas and research into that square of responsibility. And private sector companies that are, for example, the product designers that we had also have a responsibility to feed in the new ideas. So we all, had a massive love-in and decided we all want to work together very collaboratively, and I'm sure we'll have lots of offline conversations about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we have the report back from the Sustainable Cities breakout group?
Yeah, we had we had a lot of enthusiasm and passion in our group. So we had a bit of definitely managed to hear from everybody finally. A couple of things that academics and researchers need to be aware of is that, often we synthesize literature or we listen to each other as academics, but we often are not able to meet the people who are actually making decisions. So their aspirations and their business sense, and what are the means that they are influenced by, and how we as a community or as a consortium, as a network of practitioners and academics can actually change those memes, because changing those memes is what might help transforming cities in terms of food systems, in terms of how the city uses its water and treats its water, wastewater, and provides habitat for biodiversity and ecosystem services. So that was one thing, that we need to go where the people are. And often, academic environments or research projects, they're not designed to help us go to these places and talk to people. That's not how we usually operate. So that's one thing that we may have to change if we have to transform cities. The other one was on nature-based solutions. This is a term that's used often in the context of sustainable cities, but the nuts and bolts of nature-based solutions are often not really understood or known, and people use the term very loosely. And if you talk to an ecologist and you talk to an urban planner, whether they can actually agree on what a nature-based solution is something that, so the evidence and data for nature-based solutions in terms of real experiments which are scalable, that is severely lacking, and we need to invest in those experiments in the urban, peri-urban areas, whether it's related to using plants in wastewater treatment systems, or whether it's new forms of urban landscape design that will provide habitat for pollinators and urban biodiversity. Whatever it is, these are things that need that type of experiments And the only way this experiment will work is if the researchers and the people who own the land, who are making decisions on the land or on the building or on a public park or on a stretch of a drain are going to be part of the solution and the design. And so that is, I think, a big challenge. Also, there were some other creative things that came up that, why can't we use, for example, we have so many buses. They also have the ability to harvest rainwater. Is there a possibility there? Apparently, this is something that has been tested in a couple of other cities around the world, and also came out of suggestions that kids have made in conversations about what they would like to do in the city. Also, the other part was that the funding for this consortium or this way of is a little difficult for us to access and engage with. So, for example, we've all been part of Indo-UK projects funded by NERC, the Ministry of Earth Sciences, and so on. And they may not provide, those avenues may not provide the opportunities for a consortium which has got multidisciplinary skills, which cuts across academia and practice. They don't probably provide the space for that. So how do we provide the space for that amongst this group, for example? If we have to go about doing this, these innovations and experiments, how do we find the funding to sustain the network and exchange of ideas? So these were some of the things that came up. And Ganesan, for example, also mentioned that it is becoming a real challenge to maintain green spaces in the city. So you really need, in terms of the rules and regulations and the view of, how, again, it comes to the means of what constitutes urban green spaces and how much we can set aside for that. There are things that at least the ecologists feel that they are in some sense, have a big handicap in terms of being able to convince decision makers of certain ways of promoting biodiversity and greenery in the city. So this is something that I think that's also needs some attention. So I think that's about it. Anybody else from the group wants to add anything that I missed out? Yeah. Okay.
Thanks, Jagdish. Can we have the report back from the Ecology and Environment group, please?
Thanks, Siddharth. So we had a fairly large group of people attending our roundtable discussion, and we had a fairly wide-ranging discussion as well. Not necessarily in all of the things that were part of the question. It sort of meandered its way across. But one of the topics that really sort of came out was engagement with communities, even while doing research, ecological research, or while doing restoration. But sort of the broad outlines of the discussion were around how could two groups engage with each other in a manner that would of course benefit both of us, but that would bring out some of this, some of the richness of the the engagement process itself, so that you're not just, because the word decolonize was used quite often. So we need to decolonize the way we engage with. So it's of course, it's a multi-level process, because as many of us in this space are from urban areas, when we engage with communities, we are also in a colonizer mindset, and that also needs to be decolonized. So when we engage with those communities, so that's and I posed a question which we weren't able to get to fully to an answer. But how can we think of a model of engagement between Indian and UK, not just institutions, not just universities, but also broadly institutions, which would be an equitable sharing of knowledge? So it's both ways. What can India obviously learn from the UK, but what can the UK learn from India? So a couple of examples were brought out. One was the frugal ecology or frugal workshop, frugal innovations workshop that Vivian mentioned. Lots of ideas that came about from that, and existing partnerships that work towards that, and how they've transformed current methods of teaching at Srishti, for example, and other places. Another thing we discussed was, so broadening this, how can we then take the best of both worlds? So an idea that was put forward was, let's take the top 3 things that India is good at in the field of ecology and environment, and the top 3 things that are that the UK is good at, and take those and pitch that to a funding agency, and let's see if we can find some momentum and get some ideas on how to fund that kind of work. There were of course gaps mentioned in terms of specific research ideas. For example, on how species respond to climate change. Can we have a better mechanistic understanding of those responses, and what that means in terms of broader, mitigation of some of those issues on the ground? What does that mean for species conservation? What does it also mean for our response, our climate change response? And something that was mentioned then was that actually we have a long history of understanding the climate change problem, but of not acting on it. So for example, we are pretty good at preventing, or we're pretty good at managing some environmental crises. We're very, very poor at preventing them. And so how do we work towards making those better? Again, these are very amorphous ideas, very broad level discussions. An interesting idea that was mentioned was that in the UK, at least all curricula or all coursework should have the SDGs as a common framework within that. And how do you take what you're teaching to address those SDGs? And is that something that we can explore better? There's a lot of scope for collaboration in restoration of ecosystems. This is, of course, the UN Decade of Restoration, and there are partners who are working on the ground. So they have models available, they have facilities available. How can we then bring in more participation from the research community into understanding those and maybe improving those models of restoration? There's also, of course, technology, sustainability strategies, and so on. And to close it off, we talked about some of the barriers and challenges to these engagements. There are several funding mechanisms, of course. Even though some exist, we need to find better ways of creating common pots that can be accessed by both UK and India researchers. An example I mentioned was the collaboration between Wellcome Trust and DBT India, which has resulted in the India Alliance coming up with a very unique model of funding biomedical research and basic science in India. And that's that's a replicable model. But there are other systemic and government level challenges, especially in ecology and wildlife research, that need to be addressed, and that needs to happen at higher levels, so that if a top UK body is funding a project, whether it's NERC or UKRI or anybody else, then it automatically is exempted from some of these regulatory frameworks that we have. That's one potential mechanism. There's visa challenges, of course, both ways, for UK researchers to visit India on research visas and for Indians to go to the UK. That, again, is a high level sort of problem that we are not going to fix, but potentially can be addressed. So yeah, I'll end with that. Thank you.
Some very interesting, important themes which have emerged from these breakout groups, and I'm sure ATRI and the British Council and the university consortiums can think about taking them forward in terms of research and action and education. Can I now call upon Mr. Salvador from the British Council to kind of do a broad wrap up of today's?
Thank you. we're short on time, so I'm going to be very brief, but can I just start off by saying it's been a fantastic morning. Can we please give them a round of applause to our hosts? It's such a lovely session and such a lovely morning. It has been certainly very stimulating and helping us reflect not only at an institutional level on what our universities are doing and how are they connecting to different actors, but certainly, at least for me, reflecting at a personal level. While you were talking, Malcolm, about fashion and the impact that it has, I was reflecting that I'm wearing my brother's shoes and shirts that I borrowed before coming here, and a suit that I bought 12 years ago. You know, and even if it doesn't fit that well anymore, these are the decisions that we take to reduce our carbon footprint. So thank you very much. Certainly, sustainability is obviously a key priority for everyone here, for the universities in the UK, for universities in India. So the potential for collaboration is very high. There's no doubt, it's a no-brainer. But the how do we collaborate? That's a different matter. And over the last week, we've been talking about collaboration. We were, as was mentioned in the beginning, 3 days in Delhi and the last 2 days here, and we have other colleagues in Kolkata and Ahmedabad. And the how has been tricky. However, this is the first time today, this morning, that I actually saw excitement. And I saw the conversations that we had. I joined the Sustainable Cities one, and the chair actually reported that we had a very, very lively conversation. We heard ideas being thrown up. Oh, we could do this, we could do that, we should do this. What you are doing is very similar to the issues that we have in the UK. So for me, it's very clear that the next step after UK colleagues go back to the UK is actually mapping what are those key areas, what are those common interests that we share with Indian institutions. And I'm pretty sure that the mechanisms will follow. That it was very, very clear to me. So I just want to thank our hosts for welcoming us with open arms, but not only because you welcome us into your home, but because you offered us your brilliant researchers to have a very, very stimulating conversation. So again, can we give them a round of applause? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Salvador. I think we have a small memento to hand over to, yes, Vivian. Yeah.
Not the same size. I apologize, this is such a tiny present, but travel makes tininess.
Thanks. Ravi, can you give the vote of thanks?
Yeah, good afternoon, and thank you for everyone for making time to participate in this session. I thank our chairperson, Professor Kamal Baba, for the opening address, and Janaka Pushpanathan, Director of the British Council, for opening remarks and for setting the stage. Thank you very much. And on behalf of A3, I thank all the panel members for sharing their insights. And I'm not sure, I hope all of you agree that when they make their statement that they're underqualified, that we totally disagree with their statement. Okay, and it was a very interactive and live session, and I thank Veena for moderating such a lovely session. And I thank Jay, Abhi, Jagdish, and Veena and Agnes for reporting back on the lively discussions that you each had in your groups, and Salvador for summarizing and appreciating the work that we're doing here. Thank you very much. I thank all the British Council delegates, all the vice chancellors of the universities for being part of this roundtable conference, roundtable on sustainability sessions. I thank all the heads of the startups, think tanks, academy heads, industry leaders from the Indian side as well for accepting our invite on a very short notice and making time to be part of this session.
And I thank Siddharth for comparing this event. And yeah. And I thank Team A3, which includes all the faculty members, the CEO, the communication team headed by Jaya, and the IT team, Gautam, and the student volunteers all over here, for all the logistics and for the active participation, and also all the staff at A3 who did all the arrangements for this session. Thank you, everyone. And